Everybody loves a hero.
People line up for them, cheer them, scream their names, and years later they'll tell how they stood in the rain for hours just to get a glimpse of the one who taught him to hold on a second longer. I believe there's a hero in all of us that keeps us honest, gives us strength, makes us noble.
Alright, wings going around here. I'm actually going to ask my brother Gavin to come up. I got a couple brothers here, 3 of them actually, coming in from out of town, and he just wants to bring some greetings from Winnipeg. So, Gavin, you want to come up?
Yeah. Hi folks, I'm Gavin. Younger, taller, better-looking associate pastor of West Lewis and Son, the home church that Brad and Trans got sent out of, where he picked up a lot of DNA and probably furthered some of the vision that he has for here.
Slow down.
We are brothers of the patch.
Slow down.
Denise, hey, I haven't forgotten how to handle your service. You just keep quiet.
Take a breath.
It's a gearing issue. Canadians use big gears when they think and listen. Irish people use small gears when they talk. It's just what it is.
Oh, is it now? So you're making it your fault.
Yes. Yes. It's entirely my fault that you all listen slowly and I speak quickly. It's a problem. Anyway, so I told Brad I should probably share some greetings. So greetings from Pastor Lewis and Son and from the big chapter in Bonsai and Winnipeg. And we're just blessed to be here. We're glad to be here. I just want to share a quick thought. Part of what I spoke last week in my message from Ephesians 4, where we're told to, rather than do the things that we would have done before, rather than act the way that we would have done before, we're called to speak the truth in love. And that's part of the vision I know that Brad has for this place, and part of the vision that is for this place. I find that we as people, and particularly as an observation of Canada, when we're called to speak the truth, we either A, don't say anything at all because we're afraid of the response we'll get to the truth. And I'm talking about in relationship with people that we're close with, and brothers and sisters, husbands and wives. We either don't say anything, or we do explosions, where we speak and we do like a file, we're grinding on each other, we crack up and scream. Anybody crack up and scream in their relationships? No, not me either. Never Brad, ever. It's great to watch. And what we're called to is we're called to speak the truth in love. And so what this community is about us learning to grow together and to speak the truth in love. And what that looks like sometimes, though, what that looks like is it doesn't look pretty and it's never terribly comfortable. Because we as brothers, and I'll use us as brothers because it's a good example, at times we can speak the truth in a way that's just enjoyable. We can just fight for each other and encourage each other in a way that is easy. But there's times when you've got to tell your brother, your sister, your husband, your wife things that they don't want to hear, but are nonetheless the truth. And we, as a people, if we're going to be the people of God, if we're going to grow to be the people that God needs us to be and wants us to be, we must be a people that are comfortable enough to speak the truth. And that means, folks, that means sometimes not only are we going to fight for each other, we are going to fight with each other for each other. There are times that as Brad's brother, I need to be in his face for his good. And there are times that I need him to get up on my chest, right on my face, and give me the finger to tell me that I need to hear what I don't want to hear. There are times when we need to be willing to risk our own comfort in order to speak the truth in love, as we're called to in Ephesians 4. So that is part of the vision I think Brad has for this place. And that's why this place is similar to what we have in Winnipeg. It's deliberately unpolished and a bit weird. Amen to a bit weird. Amen. That's a beautiful thing. So thank you, Brad. Thank you for having us and for putting up with this. And thank you for having us here tonight. It's a blessing and honor to be here. God bless you.
Yeah. All right, I'll lower this back now. All right. Well, good evening. Tonight, we're going to wrap up a series that we've actually been in for the last number of weeks called Heroes and Our Heritage. Over the last number of weeks, we've looked at the vast heritage that we as adopted children of God have. We've looked at heroes from the Old Testament, such as Abraham, Joseph, and Tamar, and New Testament heroes like Peter and Paul. We've also looked at contemporary heroes like Darren, who was here a couple weeks ago, pastor of Ridgeview Church. who are leaving behind a heritage of faith for the generations to come, and who encourage us to know that we can also. Last week we looked at John the Baptist, the wild man from the wilderness, and how he was a forerunner to Jesus. So Jesus, it seems only natural that we finish the series off by looking at him, our greatest hero, does it not? Well, that's what I want us to look at tonight. We're going to be looking at the account of the Last Supper in the Gospel of John. And as always, there could be a quiz. So can anybody tell me what chapter that is found in John?
Yeah.
You can Google it. Going once?
There's candies.
There's candies involved. No, good guess though.
You must know, you're preaching.
It's chapter 13.
Good job.
Now, can anybody find it? This is an easy prize. Can anybody find it and tell me what page it is in the Bible that's on the table? It's a race. So,
It's dark.
698.
excellent.
Don't take candy from strange men.
You know, one of the things I like about Jesus the most? He was a happening guy. He lived, he loved, he ate, he drank, he hung out with friends. You guys in Winnipeg will understand this. If there had been a Timmy's around, we hang out at a Timmy's on Friday nights. He would have been there on Friday nights, checking out the latest and greatest in camels, talking and laughing with people. I doubt if there was ever a dull moment if you were hanging around with him. Jesus was also a revolutionary. He loved to say and do things that turned people's expectations on their heads. You never knew what he was going to do next. He always seemed to stir things up. And being around him would have been a lot of fun. But it also would have kept you on your toes, don't you think? How many of us have had a friend whom you never knew what to expect from next? They always seemed to buck the system. Crazy things always seemed to happen around them. One of those guys that you knew getting together with them was going to be a heck of a night, but it could land you in jail. I've been there, done that. Thankfully, I retired to be sure she always looks after me that. Seriously though, I think Jesus had a lot in common with that guy. And I want to look at Jesus tonight, the revolutionary. Jesus the pot stirrer. Jesus the guy who kept everyone on their toes, wondering what he was going to do next. He didn't do it so that those around him would be nervous and afraid of what was coming next. He did it because staying alert and on one's toes, as we'll see, is the key to discerning what he is doing and wants to do in our lives and in the world. By exploring the account of the Last Supper in the Gospel of John, we'll see how Jesus' revolutionary actions demanded a response from us that will change the world. The passage, as I said earlier, is found in chapter 13 on page 751 if you want to look it up. I'm not going to read it out because it's fairly lengthy. You can follow along as we go through it. Just for some background, Jesus has arrived in Jerusalem for the Passover celebration. And what I really like about John's Gospel is that John is really good at providing his readers with insight into what's going on in the story. So if you haven't read John, you should read John, because it's actually one of the best Gospels. Chapter 13 starts off with the narrator telling us that Jesus knew the time had come for him to return to the Father. Verse 1 ends with, he had loved his disciples during his ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. Some translations use the wording, and now he showed them the full extent of his love. These words to us as the reader put us on notice that Jesus is going to do something that we should pay attention to. Namely, how does he show them his love? We're also told that Judas has already decided to betray Jesus and that Jesus knew about it. So we have Jesus and his disciples sitting down to a meal. Jesus knows that his time remaining with them is short, and he's about to be betrayed by one of his own. So what does he do? What would we do in that situation? I suspect we would try to change how things were going. We'd point out Judas's betrayal and cut him off the path. We'd save our skin, right? But is that what Jesus does? No. Instead, he does something completely unexpected. Remember how I said earlier that Jesus was a revolutionary. He liked to keep people on their toes, and guessing what he was up to. Well, this is a perfect example. When I think of this story of the Last Supper, I picture the disciples reclining around the table. I know Da Vinci's famous Last Supper picture has them all seated around the table, but that really isn't quite right. He was painting that scene about 1,500 years after the events, and assumed a European setting with a table and chairs. The actual custom of the time was to have couches that everyone would lay on and the food was passed amongst them. Often these couches were kind of lined up so that each person physically reclined on the next. So everybody's relaxing, enjoying their meals, when suddenly Jesus gets up, strips off his robe, and proceeds to wrap a towel around his waist. Now, if someone did that at a dinner party we were attending, we'd think it would be pretty strange, wouldn't we? Well, the disciples would have as well. But there's more going on here for them than we reading the story in the 21st century. We have a lot of flexibility in what we wear. Just look around the room here tonight, and you'd see that we have a great variety of choice in clothing. What type it is, how many layers we want, etc. Now, the Jewish custom at the time, there was a lot more structure to it. There were even indications by clothing as to your status within the community. See, Jewish men usually wore an inner tunic and an outer tunic or robe and an outer garment or cloak. They normally removed the cloak when indoors but kept the outer tunic on. So what Jesus did was remove his outer tunic and strip down to his inner one. Then he wrapped a towel around his waist. And dressed that way, he looked exactly like a slave, because that's what slaves were worn in those days. Now, we looking at this today would think his actions a bit odd, but to the disciples it would have caught them completely off guard. Jesus is their master, their teacher, and all of a sudden they're trying to reconcile that his appearance is as a slave. I'd love to have been a fly on the wall there. I can imagine that a plate or two was dropped and broken. To put this in perspective today, it'd be like us showing up at McDonald's and finding Stephen Harper behind the till asking us if we want fries with that. It would make you wonder if you slipped and fell on your head on the way in. Now Jesus, ever the one to do the unexpected, goes a step further. Not only does he suddenly look like a slave, but then he acts like one. He gets a basin, sets it on the floor, takes a jug of water, and pours it into it. Then he takes this basin around and begins to wash each of the disciples' feet. After he's washed each disciple's feet, he dries them with a towel wrapped around his waist. Now, this whole practice seems probably a little weird to us today. We don't usually make a point of washing our feet separately from our body, and we certainly wouldn't do it communally at a dinner party. In Jesus' time, however, sandals were the footwear of choice, and the climate was dry and dusty, and people walked everywhere they went. It was considered proper hospitality then for a host to offer guests water to wash the dust from their feet. The host didn't wash their feet for them. They generally did it themselves, or sometimes a household slave would be called upon to do it. Again, could have been a fly on the wall. Jesus' sudden transformation into the appearance of a slave shocked the disciples. Then his choosing to act like one had to have blown their minds. It was a good thing that they were generally younger men, fishermen types, or some of them might have had heart problems. Now when Jesus comes to wash Peter's feet, we see how completely unexpected his actions were and how shocking they would have been. You can almost hear the quiver in Peter's voice as he asks, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus' response to Peter's question is great. He isn't about to spoon feed the disciples. He's teaching them, allowing the experience to speak louder than words at this point. So he replies, "You don't understand now what I'm doing, but someday you will." Now Peter, understandably, is not satisfied with this answer, and true to form, overreacts. Peter's a great disciple. He's Jesus' right-hand man. He leads the church after Jesus returns to the Father, and he's one of my favorites, and we looked at him a couple weeks back. The reason I think he's one of my favorites is because he is so real. He's a hothead. He often reacts before he thinks. He's a great example of the saying, "Open mouth, empty head." So Jesus' answer isn't good enough for Peter. Jesus' actions go so against the norm that Peter can't wrap his head around his teacher, turning the tables and serving him. So he responds in anger, "No, you will never wash my feet." But Jesus replies, "Unless I wash you, you won't belong to me." And we see Peter overreact again and shift to the exact opposite when he says, "Then wash my hands and head as well, not just my feet." You can hear the patience in Jesus' voice as he explains to Peter that this is not necessary. He tells him, "A person who is bathed all over does not need to wash, except for the feet, to be entirely clean." Now, after Jesus finishes washing the disciples' feet, he puts his robe back on and sits down. He then asks the disciples if they understood what he was teaching them. He goes right to the heart of the matter and points to the unexpected nature of his actions. He affirms their understanding that he is their Lord and teacher, but then points to his actions as an example to be followed by them because he, as their teacher, has done it. He encourages them to wash each other's feet and promises that God will bless them when they do. Now there's a valid message that we can take from this story about servant leadership. Most of us have probably heard a message delivered somewhere about just that, based on this passage. Jesus himself tells us that he came to serve. When I first started preparing for this message, that's where I thought it was going to go. What we think doesn't always match up with what God has planned, however. As I dug into the text, it seems there's something even bigger going on in the story. The narrator at the beginning points us towards it when he states that Jesus now showed them the full extent of his love. See, this story is about serving, but it's even more about love. It's a story about the revolutionary nature of Jesus, that is God's love. Jesus, through his unexpected actions, calls into question the worldview that the disciples are operating under. His actions challenge their preconceptions of how relationship works. How can one be a teacher and a slave? Why would someone want to serve another? Jesus, through his act of foot washing, demonstrates that love has no strings attached. It's not based on a tit for tat, or you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours way of thinking. See, the disciples' worldview or understanding of relationship and status up to that time is what is called a client-patron system. Basically, a wealthy person or a patron gives support to a number of people under them, clients. The expectation is that these clients would support the patron by honoring them. Middle Eastern society at the time of Jesus, and still to a large part today, is a society centered around honor. A patron didn't need to be wealthy either. They could support or patronize their clients in other ways, as is the case with Jesus, who they looked up to as their honored teacher and Lord. He taught them, and they would have seen themselves as owing a debt of honor back to him. That's why Peter has such a hard time believing that Jesus wants to and should wash his feet. Allowing Jesus to do so under the patron-client system would have elevated Peter higher in status than Jesus and actually taken honor away from Jesus. That's why Jesus' actions in this story are so important. He does the unexpected. He puts the disciples on notice that they need to stay on their toes. They need to pay attention and question their understanding of the world and of love. Jesus is modeling the need to become the servant, but even more importantly, he's calling the disciples to think outside the box. They're not to fall for the trap that says they are constrained in how they should treat others based on a view of status. The whole idea of status is thrown out. The disciples are called to embrace the love of Jesus as just that, freely offered love with no strings attached. Accepting his offer allows them to engage in deep relationship with him, casting off their preconceptions of what or how relationship works, and see that true relationship and knowledge of another is found through love. Now, earlier I said that Jesus was a revolutionary, a pot stirrer, a guy who kept everyone on their toes. This part of his character was very deliberate and is key for us to discern what he's doing and what he wants to do in our lives and in the world. The story is divided into two main sections. First, the foot washing, then the explanation and call to follow his example. The second part, the call to follow his example, is very important, but it is impossible until we've accepted his offer of love and his definition of love, as demonstrated in the first part of the story. Jesus does not simply issue a call for service. He issues a call to give as he gives, to love as he loves. And this is where things really get interesting and exciting, because we get to see how doing so will impact our lives and the lives of those around us. We get to see how Jesus' revolutionary nature will bring about change not only in believers, but in the world itself. We get some insight into the plan of God for the redemption of his creation. A little bit later in the story, Jesus gives a new commandment to his disciples based directly on the lesson learned in the foot washing. He tells them to love each other. Just as I have loved you, you should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. He calls his disciples and us to embrace his revolutionary nature, to turn the world's understanding of love on its head and follow his example. In doing so, we reveal Jesus to the world. Now, I said this commandment gives us some insight into God's plan for the redemption of the world. When we think about how following Jesus reveals him to the world, we immediately think of revealing as evangelism. That is a correct insight. Following Jesus' example and loving others in ways that question the world's understanding of love does serve as a witness to God, so that they may know he is real. But again, there is something deeper going on in Jesus' command. When the faith community embodies Jesus' love, it not only reveals his identity, but it also assumes a new identity for itself, shaped by his. That's where the real power of God's plan is demonstrated, in the transformation of believers. As we embrace his definition of love and discard a worldly understanding, we're conformed more and more into the image of Christ. We become Jesus with skin on. There's one last thing I want to look at from this story. At the beginning of it, we're told that Jesus knew Judas was going to betray him. And I pointed out how Jesus didn't react the way we probably would have. I haven't paid a lot of attention to Judas since then. But he does play a major role in the story. 5 times over the course of this story, it's brought to our attention that Judas will betray Jesus in verses 2, 10, 18, 21, and 26. Now, as a general rule, if something is brought up more than once in a passage, it's probably of some significance. The issue of Judas's betrayal is brought up 5 times, so you can bet there's something important to be learned from it. In order to understand the importance of Judas in this story, we need to look back at verses 12 and 13. Verse 12 reads, "After washing their feet, he put on his robe again and sat down." Do you see the significance of this statement? After washing their feet. The statement is inclusive of all disciples. Judas has not left the scene yet. That doesn't happen until much later in verse 30. So in the foot washing scene, we see Jesus, knowing what Judas is going to do, still washing his feet, still expressing his love for Judas. Why? The answer is found in the next verse, verse 13. In it, Jesus says to his disciples, "Do you understand what I was doing? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, because that's what I am." Jesus' definition of love is unconditional. He is their teacher, and he is calling them to accept his definition. He's also calling them to follow his example and do the unexpected, to not be conformed by the world. Now, I may be showing the effects of my Mennonite education with this interpretation, but I believe it to be a valid one. In washing Judas's feet, Jesus refuses to limit his options and respond on evil's terms. In much the same way, he encourages us to turn the other cheek or go the extra mile in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus' choice here to serve in the presence of hostility challenges it, not in the expected way, however. Instead, by doing the unexpected, he issues a call to recognize a different option, to cast aside the norm and embrace a new way of life. The fact that Judas does not do this is evidence that such change is difficult and that not all are going to take up the challenge. I started off tonight by saying Jesus was a revolutionary. That he loved to say and do things that put people's expectations on their heads. He never knew what he was going to do next. He always seemed to stir things up. And we've seen in the account of the foot washing that he didn't do it so those around him would be nervous and afraid of what was coming next. He did it in order to challenge them and us to look at things differently, to not accept what the world dictates as our options, but instead to look to him to see what our true options are. The foot washing story reveals Jesus' unconditional love for the disciples. And it's this love that holds the promise of new life for them and for us. So that begs the question, what are we going to do about this knowledge? When we started this series, we defined a hero as, first, a person of distinguished courage or ability, admired for their brave deeds and noble qualities. And second, a person who, in the opinion of others, has heroic qualities or has performed a heroic act and is regarded as a model or ideal. We also looked at the meaning of heritage as being something that comes or belongs to one by reason of birth, an inherited lot or portion. Now, Jesus is definitely working in both of these definitions. He sacrificed himself for the family of God, and by doing so, the offer of adoption into that family exists. That's the heritage that he's passed on to us. So again, I'll put it to everyone here. What are we going to do with the knowledge that Jesus has demonstrated his love and promises us a new life if we simply choose to accept it? What are you going to do? Now, whether you've never known Jesus or you have before and drifted away, if you think you want to accept his offer, it's a pretty simple thing to do. There are no classes to take, no conditions to meet. It doesn't require that you go around knocking on doors, handing out pamphlets, or standing on street corners holding signs. All you need to do is humbly and honestly tell God that you know you've blown it and that you want his help. A simple prayer like this, and if you feel inclined, pray along. Jesus, I know I haven't lived up as you would want me to. I can't do it alone. Would you please help me? I know you died for me and paid the price for my sin. Thank you. Please come into my life and lead me into the new life you've promised. Now, if you prayed that prayer or want to, or simply want to talk about it more, please grab one of us here. We'd love to talk about how doing something similar has changed our lives completely 180. And if you aren't at the point where you want to accept his offer, I encourage you, keep exploring. Keep looking for the truth. Keep coming back. You're always welcome here, and we'd love to be a part of your journey. Well, that wraps us up for tonight and brings an end to this series. I don't have a specific passage to point you to towards next week, so I guess you'll get off for a week quiz-wise. Please stick around after service, though, for some coffee and snacks. We believe this is actually one of the most important parts of the night, just getting out and hanging with each other, getting to know each other. And may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. May you keep the rubber side down and your eyes fixed on him. God bless, and we'll see you next week.